Sit yourself down there. Yes, that chair by the fire will do nicely. The wind's howling across the Suffolk flatlands tonight without a tree to slow it, and you look like you felt every mile of it. Here, let me fill your glass. This ale's from Woolpit's own brewery, and it's older than the story I'm about to tell you. Well, perhaps not quite that old, but close enough. You'll have passed through Woolpit on your way here most likely. Little village tucked between Bury, St Edmunds and Stowmarket. Nothing much to remark upon at first glance. The Swan's there still, of course. Red brick frontage from the Georgian years, but the bones behind are far older. Timber frame from the 15th century, maybe earlier. The sort of place where the beams remember things the walls have forgotten. There's a sign in the village square. You might have noticed it. Shows two children holding hands, and beside them, a wolf. Seems an odd thing to commemorate, doesn't it? Two children and a wolf in a Suffolk village where wolves haven't walked for 700 years. But that sign's there for a reason. It marks something that happened in Woolpit during the 12th century. Something that the chroniclers of the day, men of learning, men of the church, felt compelled to write down despite their own disbelief. The name itself gives you a clue. Woolpit. Wolfpit in the old tongue. Woolpit. These weren't metaphorical dangers, you understand. They were real excavations, deep trenches hidden under brushwood, dug to trap the wolves that roam the dense forests of East Anglia, back when the land was still half wild. Dangerous places. Places where things fell and couldn't climb back out. The year was somewhere in the middle of the 1200s. England was in turmoil. King Stephen and his cousin Matilda had torn the country apart, fighting over the crown. The chroniclers called it the anarchy, that period. Said Christ and his saints slept through those years. Villages burned. Fields went unploughed. Men who should have been tending sheep were carrying pikes instead. But by the time our story begins, the worst of the fighting had passed. It was harvest time. Late August, perhaps early September. The air would have been thick with chaff dust, the sound of scythes cutting through wheat, the rhythm of work that's older than memory. The reapers were in the fields outside Woolpit, bent to their labour under a sky gone white with heat. Then someone heard something. Not the usual sounds of harvest, something else. A sound coming from the wolf pits at the edge of the woodland. They found two children there, a boy and a girl, the boy being younger. They were huddled together in that pit, blinking up at the light like creatures that had never seen the sun before. And here's the thing that stopped every reaper's hand, that made grown men step backwards and reach for the crosses round their necks. The children's skin was green, not pale, not sickly. Green as new leaves in spring. Green as ivy climbing the church wall. Their clothes were strange too, made of material no one recognised, cut in a fashion that belonged to no county in England. And when they opened their mouths to speak, what came out was not English, not French, not Latin, not any language the villagers of Woolpit had ever heard. Just sounds. Soft, sibilant sounds that meant nothing. They took the children to the manor house of Sir Richard de Colne, the local knight who held lands in these parts. What else could they do? Leave them in the pit? Two children, however strange, were still children. They needed shelter. They needed food, except the children wouldn't eat. Sir Richard's household did what any Christian household would do. They brought bread, fresh from the morning's baking. They brought cheese and cold mutton from the larder. They brought milk in wooden cups, still warm from the cow. The children stared at these offerings as if they were looking at stones. The boy began to weep. Quiet, exhausted tears that said he'd been crying for a long time already. The girl held him close, her small arms wrapped around his shoulders, and she wept too. But neither of them would touch the food. This went on for days. The household tried everything. Honey cakes, dried apples, fresh eggs. The children grew thinner, their strange green skin seeming to darken with hunger. And still, they refused. They would pick up the bread, sniff it, then set it down again with a kind of confused desperation, as if they wanted to eat, but simply couldn't understand what they were being offered. Sir Richard's steward began to mutter about changelings, about fairy children left in place of human ones, children who couldn't eat Christian food because they belonged to the other world. The cook blessed herself every time she had to enter the room where they were kept. Even Sir Richard, a practical man not given to superstition, found himself wondering what manner of creatures he'd taken into his home. Then one afternoon, someone brought in vegetables from the kitchen garden, broad beans still on their stalks, the pods fat and green with the late summer harvest. The moment the children saw them, everything changed. The girl seized the beanstalks with both hands, her fingers trembling. The boy reached out too, making small, urgent sounds in that language no one could pass. And then they did something that would be recorded by the chroniclers, something so specific and strange that it carries the weight of truth. They tore the stalks themselves, not the pods, the woody stems of the plants. They ripped them open with their fingernails, searching desperately inside the hollow tubes for the beans. Finding nothing but pulp and air, they began to cry again. Harder this time. The sound of it was terrible, the servant said later. The sound of creatures starving in the midst of plenty because they couldn't understand how to reach the food. One of the kitchen girls, moved by pity, or perhaps just unable to bear the sound any longer, took a pod from the pile and cracked it open. The beans inside gleamed pale green in the afternoon light. She held them out. The children fell on them like wolves on a carcass. They ate the beans raw, pod after pod, their fingers working frantically to open each one. They ate until they were sick, then ate more. And for the first time since they'd been pulled from that Woolpit, they stopped crying. After that, they would eat nothing else. Just beans. Raw beans, day after day. The household began to wonder if they would starve after all, locked into this one strange food. But slowly, over weeks, the children began to accept other things. Bread soaked in bean broth first, then bread on its own, then other vegetables, small portions of meat. And as they learned to eat the food of Woolpit, something else happened. The green began to fade from their skin, not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, like a stain being washed from cloth. The verdant colour leached away until their skin was the same pale tone as any other English child's. The boy never thrived, though. He remained small, sickly, withdrawn. He learned a few words of English, but spoke them reluctantly, as if the language hurt his mouth. The servants said he had the look of something that had been uprooted, something dying slowly away from the soil that had made it. They baptized him, hoping Christian grace might strengthen him where food had failed. It didn't. Within a few months of arriving in Woolpit, the boy died, quietly in his sleep, with his sister holding his hand. They buried him in the churchyard at St. Mary's, that great church that still stands in Woolpit today. its tower visible for miles across the flat Suffolk fields. The girl survived. Her name, they decided, was Agnes, or perhaps that's what they called her, and she simply stopped correcting them. She grew stronger, learned English properly, lost the last traces of green from her skin. Within a year, you wouldn't have known her from any other servant girl in Sir Richard's household, except for her eyes, perhaps. The servants said her eyes never quite lost a certain strangeness, a certain elsewhere quality, as if part of her was always looking at something the rest of them couldn't see. And eventually, when her English was good enough, when she'd been in Woolpit long enough to trust the people around her, Agnes told them where she'd come from, where she and her brother had been before they climbed from that wolf pit into the blinding Suffolk sunshine. She told them about the Twilight Land, about St. Martin's country, where the sun never properly rose. The story Agnes told was recorded by two chroniclers, William of Newburgh, writing from his abbey in Yorkshire, and Ralph of Coggeshall, an abbot whose monastery lay just 26 miles south of Woolpit. Both men were scholars. Both were cautious about including the tale in their histories, but both felt compelled to set it down, because too many reliable witnesses had sworn to its truth. Agnes said she and her brother came from a land called St. Martin's Land, a place where the sun never rose, where everything existed in a permanent twilight, like the grey light just before dawn or just after sunset. Everything there was green, she said. The grass, the trees, the very air seemed tinged with that colour. And across a great river, they could see another country, bright and luminous, but they could never reach it. They'd been tending their father's cattle one day when they heard a sound. A great sound, she called it, loud and resonant, like bells ringing from some unimaginable distance. The sound drew them. They followed it into a cavern, a passage through the earth, and they kept walking through the darkness because the sound was ahead of them, calling them forward. Then suddenly they were climbing upward, and the darkness gave way to light, blinding, painful light that burned their eyes after a lifetime of twilight. They stumbled out into the wolf pit, dazed and terrified, and the entrance they'd come through was gone. Just earth and roots where the passage should have been. They couldn't find their way back. They couldn't hear the bells anymore. Just the strange sounds of the reapers working, the foreign tongue of England's soil. Now, the scholars who've studied this tale, and there have been many over the centuries, offer explanations. Some say Agnes and her brother were Flemish, that they were children of the mercenaries who fought for rebel nobles against King Henry. In October of 1173, just a few miles north of Woolpit, a great battle was fought at Fornham. Thousands of Flemish soldiers were slaughtered in the marshes, hunted down by local peasants with flails and forks. Perhaps Agnes and her brother were from a nearby settlement. Perhaps they fled into Thetford Forest when the killing began, their parents already dead, and lived in the dense woodland eating what they could find. The green skin, these scholars say, was chlorosis, green sickness, the mark of severe starvation, of children who'd hidden in the dark forest canopy for weeks or months, eating raw vegetables, their bodies slowly failing. The strange language was simply Flemish, utterly foreign to isolated Suffolk villagers who'd never travelled beyond the next market town. And the Twilight Land? A child's memory of living in the perpetual gloom beneath ancient trees, too frightened of the soldiers to venture into the open sunlight. It's a rational explanation, perhaps even the true one, but it's no less terrible for being rational, is it? 2 children fleeing massacre, watching their parents cut down, hiding in the dark like animals, slowly starving, slowly turning green with sickness, until they followed the sound of church bells, real bells, from Bury St. Edmunds, through some old smuggler's tunnel or forgotten mine working, and emerged into a world where they couldn't make anyone understand where they'd been or what they'd seen. Agnes lived for many years after that. She married, eventually, a man from King's Lynn, became as English as anyone, but the chroniclers noted she remained, in their words, rather loose and wanton in her conduct. Perhaps that's just medieval judgment of a woman who'd seen too much. Or perhaps some part of her never quite fit into the world of ordinary sunlight. Perhaps she was always half remembering that twilight country, that land of St. Martin where the green never faded and the bells still rang in the darkness. The Swan in Woolpit remembers. The sign in the village square remembers. 2 children and a wolf, cast in iron, still standing watch after all these centuries. St. Mary's Church still rings its bells at evensong, the same bells that might have called 2 lost children out of the earth 800 years ago. And in the fields around Woolpit, when the mist comes down in autumn and the light goes grey and uncertain, you might find yourself wondering about the places beneath our feet, the passages we don't know about, the sounds we can't quite hear. The fire's burned low now, hasn't it? Just embers left, glowing like eyes in the dark. Your glass is empty too. Let me fill it one last time before you head back out into that wind. Here's to the lost children, to Agnes and her brother, whatever land they truly came from, to the boundaries between one world and another, and to the sounds that call us across them, to the strangeness that lives in the margins of history, in the stories that scholars can't quite explain away no matter how hard they try. And here's to remembering that the most frightening tales aren't always the ones about monsters. Sometimes they're about children who couldn't find their way home. Sometimes they're about the green sickness that comes from hiding in the dark too long, about the twilight that settles over a life and never quite lifts. Now off you go. The night's not getting any younger, and neither are we. Mind your step on the way out, and if you're ever passing through Woolpit, stop at the Swan, have a drink, look at that village sign, and listen carefully when the church bells ring. You never know what you might hear in the spaces between the notes. What old sound might still be calling from beneath the Suffolk soil, trying to guide something lost back to where it belongs. Some passages, you see, were never meant to go in just one direction. You've been listening to British Pub Lore. Mind how you go.